I think just a few things about today. We will collapse the second session into the first session. And that is because Yolisa Piki said he won't be able to join us today following the outcomes of the Nugent Commission, where Judge Cruz admitted to putting together a false report on the road unit, making mistakes. So there's some urgent things to come up with. Of course, Yolisa was a former member of SARS with Ivan Pillay, Johan van Nockenburg, and others who were essentially expunged from SARS illegitimately. At least this is what the report is. So this morning, and lunch will be brought earlier from 12 till 1. After that, we will have the final session from 1 till about 2:30, which means we'll finish a bit earlier today. After that, we will have the final session from 1 till about 2:30, which means we'll finish a bit earlier today, which I think many people will be happy about. So that's just in terms of logistics. Because we're finishing earlier on, we won't have tea. We'll just go straight through. So on that note, I will introduce the first session this morning, which is looking at some of the limitations of other initiatives to address illicit financial flows, basic ocean and profit shifting, including the problems with the OECD reports. But we'll go beyond that and look at the challenges facing SARS, and then we'll move beyond that into looking at further initiatives that we can implement now to address illicit financial flows and profit shifting. On the panel this morning, Detectives Unit at Oxfam, South Africa. Following him will be
the way we call him, we say
Thank you for that. Following Thembinkosi, was Mama said, I can't even pronounce, I can't. We'll have Nicolaou, technical advisor on an EU-funded capacity building program on employment promotion at the Government Technical Assistance Center at the National Treasury. She's also worked on illicit financial flows since 2011 and has done a lot of work on these issues for some time. We'll be speaking on the importance of beneficial ownership registries. Last but not least will be Sunita Manik, who is a former member of SARS, also headed up former head of the Large Business Center and member of EXCO at SARS. So in that order, they will each have 20 minutes to present. Following that, we'll have some time to engage with the discussions and ask any critical questions that you may have. So without further ado, I hand over to Comrade Thembinkosi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As it has been said, my name is Thembinkosi. Can I use the flip chart? Is it okay? Okay, so
Just tell it that way.
Turn it around.
Tell it around. Yeah.
so comrades, mine is very easy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the limitations of the OECD BEPS process or the report. So for some of you who wouldn't know, the OECD is a group of rich countries, most of them from obviously overseas if we are sitting in Africa. This group of very rich countries under the OECD and the group of 20 countries, they decided some years ago that they were going to engage in what they called the base erosion and profit shifting process. The idea being that they wanted to find out how they can work on the international tax system so as to prevent these issues of base erosion and profit shifting. I understand we all know what it is, this base erosion and profit shifting. In terms of taxation, there is obviously a tax base. So a tax base is that thing that you tax. So yesterday there was an example that was made where they said if a company makes 1 million rand, 1 million rand, and then the 28% would be your corporate income tax. So in terms of taxation, the tax base would be the 1 million profit of the company. So that would be the tax base. So the 28% would be the tax that is levied on the company by way of corporate income tax. So when we talk about tax bases, we're simply talking about the basis of all taxation. So base erosion and profit shifting is a process that companies would then certainly try in as much as possible to reduce this, so that at the end of the day you find that the base is maybe 500K instead of 1 million rand. So it follows that if under this system the tax paid was 280,000 rand, under this system the tax will then be reduced by half. So which means the company will now pay only 140,000 rand. So that simply base erosion is those things that the company will do in order to reduce its tax base so that it reduces its overall tax. So in my presentation, I will cover a little bit about who the OECD are, and then talk about why an initiative for fair taxation disadvantages the industrialized countries, such as the members of the OECD, which then explains why such a process cannot be led by the OECD, because the OECD are the ones who benefit from the current system. And then I'll talk about current efforts to curb illicit financial flows and BEPS, and also talk about recommendations. So that's a map over there of the OECD countries. That's a map of OECD countries. So if we can see that the OECD countries are highly concentrated in Europe, and then it includes Australia, Canada, and the United States of America. So those are the OECD member countries overall. So when we talk about the OECD, the people who initiated the BEPS process, these are the countries that initiated the process. So they initiate the process. The OECD are a group of 34 democracies with market economies, which means these are market economies. They are not socialist-oriented economies. They are capitalist markets, market fundamentalism, and all of that. And then there's also other 79 member economies which have undertaken that they are going to promote economic growth, prosperity, and sustainable development in their countries. So they participated in preparing this OECD BEPS process. And in terms of the process, they came up with the action plan, which had 15 action items. So these 15 action items included, amongst others, the measures to talk to the challenges of the digital economy. If we may understand the digital economy, comrades, is that nowadays we do not need a physical shop where we go and shop for certain goods, services, and the like. You can go to the internet now, you put in your credit card, and then you order your goods, and then they will be delivered at your house. So because of the absence of physical place of business, where the actual business is undertaken, where the exchange is undertaken, it is easy for these activities to be outside the view of the tax authorities, as it were. But even if tax authorities were to be aware of these transactions, the mere fact that it is difficult to say this is the place where the business transaction happened, it then becomes very difficult for someone to assess taxation. We do know, comrades, that in terms of taxation, there are two methods: the source-basis taxation and also residence-basis taxation. Source-basis taxation is the place where we talk about where did the income or the business activity that gave rise to the income happen. Now, in terms of residence-basis taxation is where is the person that earned the income? Where is that person resident? So in terms of the discussion is about if you are resident in South Africa, then you become a tax resident of South Africa. If you are resident in Mozambique, you are a tax resident of Mozambique. Now, in terms of the definition of residence, then it determines whether you are going to be taxed in South Africa or you are going to be taxed in Mozambique. Now, when we talk about taxation, it's taxation of individuals and it's taxation of corporate entities. Now, if we think about the digital economy then, the question becomes, where is Google resident? So that we can be able to accept taxation. You know, if we talk about the transaction where they are selling software, where are they resident for purposes of taxation? So the beauty is that Google then chooses where they are going to be resident for purposes of taxation. Now, even amongst the small group of countries in Southern Africa, we do know that we have different tax rates. It also makes sense, therefore, that any business person would choose the country with the lower rate of tax to be resident for tax purposes. So in terms of the action point number one, the issue was about thinking about how do we then start to talk about residence, especially when it comes to the digital economy. How are we going to tax the digital economy? So the digital economy is huge and is growing. When we talk about illicit financial flows and all the problems we're talking about, we have not started to talk about even domestically. Some companies that are trading online, where you find that they are not charging VAT because they are not registered for VAT and they are not going to remit for VAT because you go online, you tell them what you want, you pay via EFT, and then they deliver the goods at your door. They don't have a physical place of doing business where an auditor from SARS can go and say, this is your warehouse, this is the number of commodities that are there. If you sell them, this is the revenue that you can earn. And then there's also the hybrid mismatches, controlled foreign company rules. South Africa is one of those countries with a CFC regime where you find that there is MTN Mauritius. And then they will tell you that MTN Mauritius is a tax resident of South Africa. So for purposes of taxation, MTN Mauritius will be a tax resident of South Africa. Now, because MTN Mauritius and MTN South Africa are two different entities, they can trade with each other. And they can derive some tax benefit by trading with each other, you see. So the control foreign company rules is also about that simple matter of how companies can take advantage of intra-company transfers and intra-company trade. And then there's also excessive interest deductions. So if we're thinking about your typical company, you'll find that you have a mining company in South Africa. Yeah. Let's say it's a mining company, right? So this mining company borrows money from the finance company somewhere, let's say, in Ireland. So obviously there's a loan that comes this direction, right? There's a loan, and then as a result, there is an interest payment that is going in that direction. So when an interest payment goes that direction, then the overall profit that will be at this level will be reduced because of the interest payment. Now, if these companies are related, it's easy for this company to transfer the interest payments in that direction. And if you look at the transaction itself, you can tell that this transaction is not a transaction that the company would have agreed to if they were totally unrelated entities. So you can imagine a situation where the ruling interest rate at Nedbank, Barclays, and the like is 15% interest. And then these guys, because they are trading with each other, they decide that they're actually going to charge each other 40% interest per annum, right? So if they are able to charge themselves 40% per annum, then it means the interest component is a cost to the business. It is transferred to the finance company. Therefore, instead of profit taking place at this level, more of the profit will be transferred to this level. And then if taxation in Ireland is 15%, our taxation is 28%, they are going to pay 15% instead of, it also depends how the interest received from a related party is treated in Canada. It might have a lower interest rate, like a 5%. So if it's transferred as interest, that would be the situation. And then there's also harmful tax practices and also treaty abuse, where you find that countries engage in treaties, and then because of the treaty structure, these companies are able to abuse the treaty status so that they are then able to take advantage of treaty advantages that they wouldn't otherwise be able to take advantage of. There's also the question of transfer pricing. So when we talk about transfer pricing, we are talking about intra-company transactions, obviously. So when we talk about a company, she was talking about Coca-Cola the other day. So the formulary that they use to produce Coca-Cola is subject to intellectual property, intellectual property rights. So this company can have an agreement. Companies that belong to the same group, they have an agreement and say, you can use my intellectual property in country A, and in return, you are going to pay me 40% of the proceeds of your sales. So instead of this company that makes the Coca-Cola concentrate, then making a huge profit, most of the profit is transferred out of the country, purportedly under the guise that they are paying for the intellectual property right. But because of that, the intellectual property right, the pricing of the intellectual property right is pegged in such a way that it is designed to remove all the profits out of this country that is there. Now, because intellectual property right is not the same as other goods and services, you won't be in a position to find comparables, things that are similar. Whereas as a tax authority, you can now say, look, you are not going to be able to charge this much because this is not how much it costs in the market. So these are the issues. So when it comes to illicit financial flows, you will see from this map that illicit financial flows are not coming from those countries that are part of the OECD. In fact, if you look at this map, you will see that the illicit financial flows, they are even unrecorded for most of the countries under the OECD. The countries that are contributing to the flows are the countries that are non-OECD countries. So, in essence, when we're talking about the political economy of this whole thing, is about the countries who are benefiting from the system, then being in charge of the process of making sure that there is justice at the end of the day, they stop and curtail this base erosion and profit shifting activities of their own companies, by the way. So it is very important that we think about these issues and then how we are going to work. So in the mining sector, you find that there is a lot of incentive for companies to be involved in illicit financial flows. If we look at the diagram in front of us, we will see that oh, it disappeared. So, comrades, there's a diagram there which shows, in terms of the question of, comrades, I need to draw the diagram, so you'll give me 2 minutes, right?
Yes.
So, in terms of, when we're talking about the mining sector, you will see that there will obviously be the small elements that the company will produce in the form of the profits. So, but the profits will come from once the government has taken out their royalties, right? So, in this case, the government will take their royalties. This is a slice that goes to the government, right? And then you will have another slice, which we will call carry interest. You know that if we talk about the new mining charter, the government is talking about carry interest, which means there's a 10% that is allocated to workers and communities. So all of these are government take. And then if you look further, you find that there is a slice, which is a bigger slice, that will be taken by the company. This is your cost recovery. So when we're talking about mining taxation, you find that out of the profits, there is also a slice, in our case of 28%, that will be taken as corporate income tax, right? So if you look at the corporate income tax, and you look at the free carry interest, and you look at your royalties, and then somewhere there you have your social labor plan obligations. On the overall, these are the things that go to the government, which we would now call the government take. So if you're thinking in terms of why mining is the one that is subject to more illicit financial flows and BEPS, is because there's a lot that needs to be taken out of mining, other than when you were talking about an ordinary company. So it makes sense for the mining company, therefore, to want to increase its share by growing the cost recovery. When they increase cost recovery, they are increasing their profit, and then they also take some out of the profit at the end of the day. And then finally, I think it is important that we talk about some of the initiatives that have been there. There is obviously the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information. As countries were expected to participate in this Global Forum, in terms of looking at information exchange, where members are expected to exchange information, where it is foreseeably relevant information for the administration and administration of the domestic tax laws. Now, the problem with the current framework is that the information is only exchanged on request as compared to automatic exchange. On request is that you have to demonstrate as the requesting party that this information is required for the administration and enforcement of your domestic laws. Some people have also argued that sometimes in order to demonstrate that you need the information, you need to demonstrate that you don't actually need the information, you already have the information. If we were to have an automatic information regime, it means countries will just say, look, there's a taxpayer who's a resident of country B. Because they are a tax resident of country B, we exchange the tax information, and then country B will look at the information and decide what to do with it. And then we have also the inclusive framework, where there has been activities to develop standards along the issues of BEPS, and also making sure that there's an effective monitoring system that is put in place to ensure that these countries, especially those countries that are non-OECD countries and countries who are thought to be low capacity countries, to develop toolkits so that we assist the taxpayers of those countries to be able to deal with matters that are raised under the OECD action plan system. There are also a number of international financial system organizations which are non-government, not intergovernmental. For instance, the Financial Action Task Force, the Bank of International Settlements, the Basel Core Committee on Banking Supervision Board, and the International Accounting Standards Board. These are some of the non-governmental organizations that are involved in the overall financial framework. So one of the things that we need to think about as civil society and activists is how we interact. Is how we interact with these institutions in a way that we start to influence their standards about how companies report. For instance, when we're talking about the International Accounting Standards Board, is one of the standards that is one of the boards that can improve on the standard around the reporting. If we talk about mandatory reporting, for instance, if they were to change their standards so that there's mandatory reporting, if they were to improve the standards and say, look, these are the things that needs to be reported on an ongoing basis in any report that is compliant. So we need to engage with these entities so that we are able to say at the end of the day, this is what we need in terms of reports. And then there's also the OECD IGF cooperation, Intergovernmental Forum cooperation, where they have been working together as OECD to think about how to support countries, including members of ATAF, the African Tax Administration Forum. They have been developing toolkits. One of the toolkits that they've developed is about monitoring the value of mineral exports. When you obtain a mineral in the ground, it's very difficult to say this diamond, this is how much it's worth. This piece of gold, this is how much it's worth, especially with precious minerals. So the question is about how can we start a process of teaching government officials how to value mineral exports instead of relying on intra-company sales, because we know that once we have intra-company sales, the minerals may be exchanged at a value that is far lower, so that the revenue that is booked in the country where the mining activity happens is lower, and the revenue is booked in the country where maybe the sale happens or the value addition happens. In terms of recommendations, in my last minute, it is important that we campaign towards the establishment of a universal intergovernmental tax body at the UN, which fosters inclusive, which works on inclusive international cooperation on these issues. I think, as we have seen, most of the entities that are there are mostly led by the OECD. It's unfair and unequal. We are not effectively participating even in the inclusive framework. You could say that only AIDC is the one that made an intervention at the inclusive framework when the issues around the question of transaction, treasury, and whatever were being deliberated. And then we were not part of that process as civil society in South Africa. Only a small group of international NGOs did present under the BEPS monitoring group. Now, we are not clear as to, because there are northern NGOs, including Oxfam, that presented, whether whatever they presented is also in line with the capacity that is existing in the revenue authorities of countries in the south. And then we need to agree on a robust framework for defining illicit financial flows. We need to form multidisciplinary teams of technical experts, including civil society experts, to measure and do more research on illicit financial flows. Because in order to understand how to curtail the base erosion and also illicit financial flows, we need to know the modes. What are the new strategies that these companies are using to extract value out of a country? And then we need to talk about southern civil society-led processes and solidarity, so that we are able to input into current processes, even those non-charter processes under the OECD and others. I think it's important that we make an input, because as it stands now, they are the people who make the rules. And then we need to engage closer to home, so that we are able to ensure that our regional economic communities and blocks, they develop relevant policies and relevant legislation to ensure that these laws, they then make it into domestic law. I thank you.
I've got a few slides, but I might actually just sort of talk to you sort of more impromptu. Let's just see. In 1999, I worked on technical assistance task team that was set up to actually look at marginal mines and how government, unions, and business, specifically, would try and assist the marginal mines, the gold mines. At that stage, the gold price had actually crashed and it was sitting at about $270 odd an ounce. And we were looking at these marginal mines because we had to do some baseline modeling on that. And how much tax do you think the gold mines in South Africa actually pay? Zero. That's absolutely right. So gold mine firms in South Africa pay, other than pay as you earn, company tax was close to zero. They actually pay nothing. They've got a very clever way of doing this. They have massive capital infrastructure that they have to sink for their shafts, and as a result they create these assessed losses, and they basically write off these losses every year, so when they do make profits, they've got all this historical loss as a result of capital infrastructure, and so they paid no tax. And so I know we tend to be quite hard on the mining sector, but the reality is that they don't pay tax in South Africa and in most parts of the world. Right, so that's just as an aside. A couple of slides up in Nigeria, they lose about 20% of oil as a result of illegal fracking, illicit mining industry. Nigeria as well, I'm sure you've seen this in the news when Shell basically extruded 1.3 billion pounds through corrupt dealings with the government around the mining sector, specifically around oil mining. And I think what I'm trying to show you here is we see this all the time, we're bombarded with it in the press, right? But we never really sit and think about, what it really is. Well, it's all illicit flows, but it's in different forms and shapes. And whether it's government or it's a very small individual who is a subsistence illegal oil fracker who's trying to survive at the end of the day, it takes on many forms, but at the end of the day, these are all forms of illicit financial flows. And the most popular one we all know, obviously, is the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and we've seen some of those numbers, and I think last year I presented quite a detailed sort of presentation on that. And then my favorite one is FIFA. We never sit and think about, these virtual states that come into a country and they actually just steal everything from them. When FIFA came into South Africa, and we were all excited about the World Cup, right? I mean, everybody was. You weren't really? You're not a soccer fan, but I was. and everybody was, and there was so much hype around it, and as a country we all rallied together. How much investment do you think is left in our country? Very little.
Minimum.
You have to pay out. Exactly. Well, that's the reality.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it did. In fact, the media rights had
It
already been
It
sold.
also gentrified.
Exactly, exactly. So media rights had already been sold, so as a country we got no access to those media rights. In fact, the majority of the tickets had also been sold, and you as a country only got a fraction of those tickets to sell. I think it was less than 10%. And then, yes, you're hoping you're going to make money on tourism and that, and yes, you do make some, but when we were looking at hot money flows when I was at the FIC, the year after 2010, so in 2011, we saw the largest outflow of hot money out of South Africa to the tune of 600 billion rand. Yeah. So yes, money comes in, but actually, and you've got to, those numbers you've got to take sort of with a bit of a pinch of salt, right? Because hot money is one of these numbers, right? It bounces up and down. The next year we're sitting at like 7 billion. So it's a number that you can't really sort of you've got to take with a pinch of salt, you've got to look at it in context. But the point was that following the World Cup, we saw massive capital outflows out of South Africa. So the point I'm trying to tell you is we look at this stuff, but we never really think about it. This is all illicit financial flows. And historically, I know when I first joined the FIC, and I was told you've got to quantify the size of the illicit economy and illicit financial flows, we were all excited. Drugs. This is where it is, right? It's all narcotics. Because narcotics sounds very sexy, right? And then we started drilling down, and actually we realized, hell, it's not narcotics. Occupational fraud and commercial tax evasion are much bigger problems that we tend to not worry about because we're so busy focusing on corruption, which is an important factor because it's a massive lever that enables all of this, but we were always focused on black market stuff, rhino poaching, narcotics in the South African sector, the gun trade, the ivory trade, etc. But we were missing the big elephant in the room, which was what were we doing about tax evasion? And the irony is that having come from the FIC, which tends to focus on trying to prevent money laundering and terror financing, so it closes all the loopholes in the banking sector, guess what happens? We start to see a new area bubbling up. We see it bubbling in trade. So we see massive illicit or masquerading as legitimate trade, but it's actually not. So the notions of trade mispricing and transfer mispricing all start to become very important to try and understand because trade-based money laundering is the way that it's actually being done now. So it's a modern form of money laundering, and the reason it's that is because customs is very weak in most countries across the world. And in Africa, it's the worst, right? So if you're a developing country, you spend very little of your resources in trying to sort out customs. An interesting fact, only 2% of all consignments globally are ever eyeballed. 2%. So guess what? You can trade and you can hide whatever you want in your trade consignments, and if you're prepared to pay a bit of a bribe, then you're sorted, right? And I remember when we were interviewing some of the sort of people that were trading in drugs and that, they used to tell you the one thing they did. So they used to sell these like clay pots, and inside this clay pot at the bottom, they had a metal sheet, and between the metal sheet and the base is where they used to stick all their drugs. And they tell you the one thing they do is they pay VAT. If you pay VAT, the tax authorities aren't going to flag that particular consignment because they know at least you're on board with your tax. So we don't scan, we don't check, we don't vet, and so trade is probably one of the easiest ways in which you can move value. And the irony about illicit flows is everything operates much like all of these, other than obviously the Nigeria oil fracking case, but the rest of it actually masquerades as legitimate commercial enterprise. Okay? So, as an authority, whether you're in tax or you're at the central bank or you're at the FIU or you're at customs or you're at parliament where you've got to have oversight of this, you've actually physically got to go and dig and hunt for this. And Sunita's probably going to talk a little bit later about what they did at SARS, actually a very successful unit at the time. And so they'll tell you a little bit of how they have to sit and dig below this corporate veil to try and see. So they hide behind this secrecy, this financial opacity, so that they can actually parade as legitimate concerns. But as you start digging deeper, that's when you start to uncover this stuff. So you need strong forensic accountants, strong auditors to actually sit in governments to try and do this. And I'll be presenting a little bit later just to show you that we think there's some interesting ways around it, which might move into the machine learning space. So moving on, one of the biggest challenges with illicit financial flows is that it is a multi-everything. It's multidisciplinary. So you'll actually see in the next slide, it covers tax, it covers accounting, it covers economics, so it covers a whole load of areas, which makes it very problematic. When I was at the FIC, the biggest challenge we had was when we were presenting the stuff we were finding, who were we presenting it to? Does it belong in the domain of the Minister of Finance, or does it sit in the intelligence space? And the irony, it's a combination, right? And who really is responsible for this? Is it the tax authority? Is it the Minister of Finance? Is it the Intelligence Minister? So already you're sitting with very muddied terrain. Lots of stakeholders. Everybody has a piece of the pie. Everybody has to work together if you want it to work. It covers a lot of disciplines. It covers a lot of jurisdictions. And it covers a lot of departments at the end of the day. So it makes it a complex area to work in. And in the development space, we like complex, we like messy. Because if it's messy, then you can actually try and work with it, but it's not pretty. And a lot of us tend to shy away from things that don't look pretty and are easy to solve because they are complicated, messy problems. And illicit flows is one of those. Right, so if you look at the tools that are available to government to try and tackle illicit financial flows specifically, there's a whole load that sits fundamentally on this side, which is the more popular ones, right? So obviously FATF is the most popular one in terms of money laundering and terror financing because it looks at illicit proceeds, the proceeds of crime. So they have a big role to play here. Then you've got the newer stuff that's coming onto the tax sort of terrain and starting to affect a lot of other government departments, including trade and industry, beneficial ownership of legal entities, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that because I participated in the National Risk Assessment on beneficial ownership for South Africa and developed a series of heat maps. I'm going to show you what it actually looks like for South Africa and what the challenges are there. Obviously, your demand resource management is another critical tool, automatic exchange of tax information, the whole BEPS and country-by-country reporting that was just presented shortly, as well as the unique consignment reference that sits in the customs space and your benchmark pricing tool. So you can see there are a whole lot of tools that tend to overlap. Those are responsibilities of different ministries, different entities, some working together, some not working together. I think the thing that was most fascinating for me was when we were doing stuff with SARS and the Ministry of Finance, the FIC, and the South African Reserve Bank was around trade mispricing. And for the first time, there was an interdepartmental working committee working on this at the request of the Minister of Finance, who is at the Zombie Commission this morning. So underneath, he had said, set up this particular entity, let's look at trade mispricing, and Randall Carlson was actually responsible for that particular unit, or that particular interdepartmental working committee. And we sat there sharing information for the first time as 4 different entities. And let me tell you, there are MOUs between those organizations to actually share information. But we share information only on a case-by-case basis. We don't share information to say, here, have a data dump, go and analyze it, join the dots and see what you come up with. So FIC does not share any of its information with SARS unless there's a particular case that has come up. FIC does receive all the cross-border flows above threshold from the South African Reserve Bank. It's joining some dots, but it's not working with SARS' trade and customs data and SARS' tax information and its risk engine to join some dots there. And SARS is working with some of the back-end trade cross-border information from the South African Reserve Bank. But we're not joining these dots, right? So the interesting thing that comes up is whenever South Africa exports, we tend to wait for nearly a year. The law allows us for up to 365 days before payment is received. So you can export today, you can have your money slashing around all over the world, and if some official catches a wake up, before 365 days are over, you could repatriate your money into South Africa, and they've got no proper checks to make sure that that money actually comes back. Imports, on the other hand, are completely different. 75% of our imports are paid in advance. So why don't we do the same with our exports? So it shows you that, and that's a small slip, right? It was a small slip in the way that the South African Reserve Bank had done some of the changes around their authorized deals around foreign exchange. So in those changes, there was an issue around exporting and they had to wait, so they introduced this sort of leeway, this concession, so okay, it's fine, your money can come back within 365 days. But they didn't put in controls to actually check whether that money in fact does come back into South Africa. And you can imagine it can do all sorts of things before it comes back, and haven't earned interest and done all sorts of things before you actually repatriate it. What this slide tries to show you is that if you look at the policy toolkit, there are a lot of policies out there to try and address financial transparency, to curb illicit flows. What makes it complex is that there are a lot of role players as well. To add to the complexity, I've just tried to layer the slide slightly so that you can understand what sits in tax, what sits in the money laundering term financing space, and what sits in customs. And some of them tend to have overlaps as well. So it just gives you an idea of what the terrain looks like and who the custodian of this work actually is. But they tend to overlap. So beneficial ownership sits partly in the tax space, it's partly, well, the recommendations from the report on the National Risk Assessment is it should be run by the Financial Intelligence Center, but it's also the responsibility of a couple of entities, including trade and industry, social development and welfare, that's responsible for NGOs, etc. So it starts to get very muddy at the end of the day. And then obviously anti-corruption is a key one that sort of sits on its own, but it's linked to ministries of finance. So if we talk about some of these key policies, who really is responsible for doing what? And so part of trying to get the story right is to actually get these departments to work together, to share information, and to become organized government that's fighting transnational organized crime syndicates. Trust me, they are far more organized than governments are. And a little story from my days at the FIC. The only way, so we used to work very covertly. Nobody was really allowed to know what we were doing. And somehow, was Floyd here yesterday? Okay. Somehow Floyd got wind of the fact that there was this FIC unit that was working on stuff. So every time that it was quite fascinating. So every time the high-level panel produced a report, Floyd used to write a parliamentary question to the president, and all of us at SARS, so Frans Tomasik and myself used to scramble to try and sort of answer these questions in Parliament. And the point I'm trying to stress is you cannot underestimate the importance and the role of civil society in this space. The only way that we could actually gain traction on the topic was because civil society was forcing government all the time to account, including the work that the AIDC did. So remember you had your first big sort of mining sort of summit, I think in 2015 or 14, I don't even remember. And I know John had approached me and said, well, can you come talk? And there was a massive spat. Everybody's like, no, we can't go there. We're not allowed to be seen there. But the point is, and that's exactly it, right? So as government, you try and operate behind the scenes and make things look pretty, but at the end of the day, you actually need civil society to keep pushing and forcing government to account. So civil society, opposition parties, they all have a voice at the end of the day, and this topic has landed on our tables and we focus on it largely because of the role that civil society plays. So I'm trying to underpin, it's a critical role. It's the one place you have a voice. And collectively, we can have a stronger voice. What makes this area even more complicated is there are a whole load of other private sector role players as well that are being supervised and monitored. And my phone's going crazy, by the way. I've been working on the job summit, and there's like a mini crisis at the moment as we prepare for tomorrow. And so I might be a bit distracted. Right, so we've got supervisory bodies, we've got all these self-regulating authorities, we've got all the financial intermediaries, so banking sector, and then we've got these like designated non-financial business professions, right? Lawyers, real estate agents, accountants, etc. But they're also some of the largest enablers in this process, right? So the Panama Papers story didn't happen because lawyers and accountants and bankers were not involved. Panama happened because you've got smart lawyers and smart bankers and smart accountants that are actually helping people navigate the laws of a country to pay as little tax as possible. Okay, so they're very complicit in the, not everybody, but they are complicit. Right, so another slide just to show you how complicated this process gets. So not only do you have the laws in your country, and you've got a whole lot of role players, and you've got some policies that are being added to you by your own institutions, but you've got a whole lot of work that's being added to you by international institutions. The World Bank, the OECD, we heard earlier on the better. There are a lot of international institutions that are actually layering even more responsibilities on countries in order to comply. So I'm just going to show you very briefly how we tackle illicit flows. Well, the first thing is you need to have some kind of a research unit and a research capability in government to inform and constantly research. The unit that I had looked at a lot of this, but what was quite interesting is we also worked on the cryptocurrency stuff in the country, trying to see what were the risks around cryptocurrency and virtual currencies, where do they actually lie, what is it? SARS is now, as a result of some of that work, together with the South African Reserve Bank, has set up a fintech unit now, and they actually look at this. But if you don't understand it, you can't legislate or regulate, etc. So you need a research unit. You need, and I'm going to quickly cover, I don't want to cover these, I just want to get to some of the threads. So what we did, so one of the things we did recently, actually, we just completed for South African government on the National Risk Assessment for Beneficial Ownership, and it actually looks at what the risks are to setting up a national registry, who should be responsible for it, what types of risks are there, and it's a very standard risk matrix, right? It's got a probability with an impact, which actually gives you a risk at the end of the day. When we looked at it, we had a brainstorming session and we tried to see what should a national risk assessment on beneficial ownership look like for South Africa, what are the areas we should be covering, and what do we ultimately want to achieve as a country. So the experts told you they wanted a secure national central public registry. Clearly we're nowhere near there, but at least we know where we'd like to head to. So we looked at a couple of areas. We looked at legislation. Does the legislation allow us to set up these public registries? We looked at resourcing capability. We looked at digital and operating systems. We looked at oversight, enforcement, monitoring, and compliance. And we also looked at the accessibility of information and coordination. And eventually, after 2 or 3 iterations, we literally came up with 4 key pillars in which we evaluated South Africa's risk. The legislative risk, the operations and systems risk, which looks at some of the digital stuff as well, monitoring, enforcement, and compliance, and obviously coordination and information sharing, which collapsed everything. And before I go to the next slide, what do you think South Africa's risk is? High, medium, low? High. So what we did is we just ranked stuff from high, medium, and low, simple numbering system. There's a series of questions with a drop-down menu that was sent to a whole lot of authorities in government and authorities. We even engaged with the banking sector, etc. And this is what the results are. So if you look at the 4-pillar assessment, 67%, 5-pillar assessment, 7%, high risk. We don't do so bad on our legislation, but Where we do very badly is on our resourcing and capability, and that's largely because when you're looking at beneficial ownership, you're not just looking at companies. If you look at the static requirement, it looks at companies, it looks at partnerships, it looks at NGOs, PBOs, CBOs, etc. It looks at trusts. And the interesting thing is that the trust law in South Africa is not geared to look at beneficial ownership in any way. The trust law in South Africa says, by the way, if the FIC has identified that a particular trust is a perpetrating company in crime, maybe it's evading tax, for example, and let me tell you, there are a lot of our country's assets that are sitting in trusts, okay? Massive ones. So what they do is they have, so if FIC sends a point across, so if it sends a note to the trust authority, the trust authority is required by its law to inform the trustees of its impending investigation. So what we discovered in this process is that allowed the FIC to pierce the tax secrecy laws, but it can't pierce trust secrecy, which makes absolutely no sense, right? So these were some of the things that came out of this process. Obviously, oversight risks were fairly moderate, but coordination risk is very high when we talk about access to information, largely because information is not being verified. We don't verify, we don't vet, and so what, and nobody really checks the information. So big weaknesses in trusts and in social development to monitor NGOs and NPOs. And if you look, the research actually shows that NGOs are often used as money laundering sort of vehicles to move money across borders. So very simple. The heat map looks like for South Africa, not too bad. We're replicating the same study for Namibia, and we've got a detail on a bigger study for Namibia as well, which looks at a slightly different risk assessment, looks at a series of institutions, a similar analysis, but for your Ministry of Finance, for your tax authorities, for your central banks, for your FIUs, and we connect all of that together. My last slide, and I'm just going to flick through that, is one of the things that we're trying to do in the Namibian government is to actually start using machine learning and artificial intelligence in this space. So a lot of developing countries have very limited capacity. So they're not going to be able to put in large boards of people that are highly skilled to actually look at this stuff, right? So the way that we're wanting to try and propose it is to actually start looking at how we use machine learning and artificial intelligence and actually start doing big data analytics. And really, the way forward is to use a conflation of big data analytics, connectivity, to try and analyze all of this in an innovative way using artificial intelligence so that we can start to see where this actually lies for developing countries. So that they don't have to try and put in lots of people. The machine learning can actually do all the first round flagging and red flagging and sending exception reports, and then analysts can take that work forward. Okay, so that's my long and short of it.
That was cool.
They seem to have such a good grip on my conference call. Really well organized.
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing? I think there's been such an onslaught of information. And it's exciting stuff. It's also challenging stuff and threatening stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about SARS, or I guess I can talk a lot about SARS. It's easy to talk when you've been ousted out of SARS, so you'll say the tough stuff and the difficult stuff. But basically, as Dominic had mentioned, I ran the Large Business Center. I was in the Large Business Center from about 2005, 2006 till about 2016 when I left. Well, I was pushed out, but that's a separate discussion. In terms of SARS itself, I spent 23 years. I first started in SARS when SARS was part of the Inland Revenue sitting in ministry. So I've seen all the changes. What I can say without a doubt, and maybe I could go straight into the large business center, is the large business center was set up in 2005. And the reason why it was set up was a recognition of the fact that multinationals, large corporates, and one looked at the threshold in excess of the group turnover in excess of 250 billion. These companies sat on our tax base, and they were important because one needed to manage their compliance, but you also needed to provide them with the service, because what people don't understand is that your large corporations influence everything that happens in a country. They're the biggest guys, they're also the largest VAT vendors, not to mention they pay corporate income tax. So they influence the tax paying culture in the country. They influence tax morality. The Large Business Center was set up with a staff of about 300. At its heyday, it was sitting at around 600. When it started, it was seriously constrained in terms of staff and capability. It was established along sectoral lines. Amujima was there at the time. And so some of the sectors were manufacturing, financial services, etc. Individuals were sourced from the private sector to come into the large business center in order to provide that kind of expertise. It was staffed with frontline people, back office individuals, audit staff, lawyers as well. So when it started, just a question of low-hanging fruit, meaning that you wanted to make sure that everybody was registered, that you were paid on time, and that you did some basic audit work. We didn't have the capability to take on very complex matters, but in some respects, I think LBC did punch above its weight in terms of taking on one or two big cases that they won. Fast forward to 2011. We started an exercise with the Reserve Bank, because I was concerned that we knew transfer pricing was happening across trade. So we knew in terms of goods, transfer pricing was taking place. My concern was nobody was looking at services. So I tasked the team to work with the Reserve Bank to get an extract of the information. We extracted Reserve Bank information on non-goods transfers out of the country for the period 2008 to 2011. Do you know how much left our country? 205 billion. This is quoted in the, no, for that period.
For 4 years, 4 years.
Yeah, it's actually 3 years. Right, so 205 billion, you find all this data, it was used by the DTC, Davis Tax Commission. So that data is some extracted data. What is even more interesting, 100 billion of that 205 billion was in the form of management fees. There was another about 40 billion in the form of regular fees. I think equally another significant amount.
What was the second? Management fees in the second?
Technical, as like advisory.
Technical advice.
Yeah. You can just hold on a minute, I'll give you the data. Sorry? Okay, so for the period 2008 to 2011, 205 billion went out in the form of non-goods payments. Right, so the services. Most of these payments obviously will come out of multinational. 41 billion is in the form of royalties, copyrights, etc. So 41 billion was significant. 101 billion was management fees.
101 billion then in management fees.
Then technical services was another 41 billion. Smaller ones were marketing research 9 billion, research and development 5 billion, agricultural, some research stuff 6 billion. Now what does this actually mean? It means that a significant amount of money left this country as payments offshore. Now these payments offshore would largely go to related party entities. So when we're talking about multinational enterprises, firstly from an LBC point of view, the tax base included groups with turnover, annual turnover in excess of 250 million. It included all mining companies, all financial services companies, and all multinational companies. Now, what is interesting, base of the large business center comprised 70% multinational companies. When I started at the LBC, our revenue that we brought into SARS was in the region of about, I think, 180 billion. When I left LBC, the revenue that we contributed to SARS was 350 billion. And so that is significant. In the time,
One third of the tax.
2011, I took over the LBC. During the period 2011 to about 2016, every year we showed double-digit growth in revenue. This is not through new taxes, simply by making sure this large base paid taxes. Across that, pay-as-you-earn and income tax, talking about 20,000 entities. But we didn't service all the 20,000. We didn't audit all the 20,000. We had particular strategies in place. So when we first started, it was just a question of basic tax compliance, VAT, pay-as-you-earn. But as we refined our approach, we took a risk-based approach. So that means, let's look at what is low-hanging fruit, easy things, obvious stuff. A simple example would be companies pay provisional tax. Now, they would take first, second, and third. The third payment is known as a topping-up payment. But what companies used to do is take the tax money and use it for cash flow purposes. Now, what does this mean? It means that we only got our money at the end. So National Treasury, when they have the weekly borrowing requirement, the cash is not there for business for the country. All we had to do was engage taxpayers. There's a particular section called Para 19.3 that says we can ask them for more money based on your latest financials, based on your management account. So we moved away from being reactive to being proactive. If I look at your business, you're supposed to estimate how much money you're going to owe me. And then you're going to divide it into two, and the first payment and the second payment. And if you don't get it exactly right, you then have the option of the third payment. But if I'm paying up to 30% as a third payment, I'm not really estimating. So in a year, I remember 1 year we brought in 14 billion just by rebasing those payments. When I left, there was less than 5% in third payments. What does that mean? Just simple maneuvering and holding companies to account means that we're not used as a bank. Another example of SARS being used as a bank. We pay the largest refunds. SARS pays approximately 150 billion rand every year in form of VAT refunds to corporates. The LBC pays out 70 billion. Most of that goes to which sectors, do you know? Mining, manufacturing. Right? That's a lot of money. So it's very important to understand what is happening in these particular sectors. But it's not only in those particular sectors. It's every single sector. We say let's focus on mining. But I guess we focus on mining because it's low-hanging fruit. There are people that are stakeholders in mining. The unions are interested. But let me tell you something. Poor compliance or questionable compliance happens across the board. Who do you think are servicing these taxpayers? Who's helping them with their aggressive tax planning? The same top 4 companies. If you read an article called Pinstripe Mafia by Prem Sikka, he talks about the fact that these 4 companies hold the global market. If I take the UK, they did a parliamentary hearing, and they found that Ernst & Young had more transfer pricing staff than the UK Revenue Agency. You have the same situation here. So, from a tax compliance point of view, I don't believe that everybody's complicit in wrongdoing. But I think that there's a culture that pervades in our society, where as long as you're making money, as long as you're pursuing your bottom line, as long as you're getting good ratings, as long as your financials look great, as long as your stakeholders are happy, It's just a question about taking the money and running. We don't think about the impact on society and all. So your big companies and your rich individuals get more at the cost of who? The poorer and the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised. And that's the problem. So part of our role at the LBC was to make sure that we engage with companies in a way that is responsible, but also hard, a little bit hard though. So in some respects, we were thought of as a little bit aggressive, because if we didn't like your replies, I would go and sit down with the team, the company, and say, we're not happy about 1, 2, and 3. We expect improvement. I remember one of the challenges that I had is I wanted to rate companies in terms of their tax compliance and to make sure that it then sits on the financial state, because disclosure and transparency, you're influencing the economy, you're influencing people. And I got a lot of pushback. But that didn't stop in our risk engine rating all of them anyway. So from a risk point of view, we had a team, and their role was, we actually have what is known as the 77 rule engine. So I don't even need a human body. We developed a program on Excel, because we don't really have all the resources and funds to do it sophisticated fashion. But the point of the matter is that risk engine throughout risk looked at companies. We could look at a company for a 10-year period and say, what has happened with your data? And it's easy. It'll take me 2 seconds to look at that cross-sectional data and say, well, I have a problem with this item and that item because suddenly this one spiked or this one doesn't make sense. But one of the worst categories is on the return. There's a line item called other creation. But you know, in a single company, that line item can be 4 billion. The next year jumps up to 10 billion. The problem with disclosure, but also there's, I was talking earlier about the SARB data, management fees, big problem. If you look at the SARB data and it's unpacked in terms of the years, you will after the financial crisis, South Africa went up. And there's a reason for this. Everybody knows the reason.
They needed more management.
The reason for that was after the financial crisis in the group, offshore was severe. Remember, South Africa has our companies. We still have a problem today. There's too much cash sitting on the books, not being injected into the economy because they have concerns about it. And in some cases, they're just holding back for it. To be difficult. But anyway.
Investment stuff.
So the problem is that cash went offshore, was moved around in that group, in the group. That money should have been here. Now let me tell you something about all these categories. It's actually meaningless, because when we did auditing, we realized management fees, technical services, royalties, etc., they are interchangeable. If I start auditing the management fees today, tomorrow they'll have a new category. They'll call it something else. We look at marketing. There was a strategy from the transfer pricing point of view in recent years called centralized services. You may have been familiar with it. What it means that if I'm sitting in a multinational group, they will isolate entities sitting in particular jurisdictions. So let's say low tax or low tax jurisdiction, Switzerland. I'll put in a centralized services. What does that do? I house in my procurement, my financial, my accounting, a whole lot of other stuff, some marketing, some research, whatever. And what do? I charge all the other group entities. Works the same way as management fees. Technical fees, what am I actually paying for? Let me talk a little bit about auditing, some of the challenges. In the early years, we looked mainly at goods and services. Transfer pricing was a little bit inconsequential at that time. I remember there was a period where the transfer pricing team didn't actually produce any results. I had a discussion with the minister and he says, you talk about a risk, but there's no results. So I challenged the team. I said, no bonus until we produce something. Funnily enough, in a 2-year period, we banked 5 billion. When I left, there was more than 30 billion sitting in work in progress. What is they talking about? Tells you the potential. And we were only scratching the surface and a small unit. less than 30 people in the team, probably less than 5 real core auditors. So the potential here is huge. The amount of money going out is huge. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about base erosion and profit shifting. Base erosion and profit shifting is about the basic understanding in terms of what was happening after the sovereign debt crisis. You saw what happened in Greece. You saw what happened with a lot of countries that failed. There was too much debt. There was actually, and nobody spoke about the fact that there was a problem with tax compliance in these countries. I remember sitting at a meeting and they were telling us that there was a tax on pools and everybody covered their pools. So when they looked to an aerial view, you couldn't see the pools. What happened during the financial crisis? A lot of mafia money surfaced because it was all cash. Who was buying up all these companies that were failing? Mafia. It's actually absolutely shocking. So anyway, in the wake of the financial crisis and sovereign debt crisis, G20 realized that there's a lot of monies sitting outside of the cake, meaning that it was sitting in all the secrecy jurisdictions. And it was creating a problem because the sovereign base was very small and it was being depleted. So they realized that we've got a problem. If we don't stem this outflow, we're not going to have much to provide basic services in our countries. So G20 tasked the OECD to say, well, we see a problem in terms of outflows. Specifically, what's happening is that you're seeing monies going from high tax jurisdictions, or perceived high tax jurisdictions. At that stage, interestingly enough, the US had a high rate, but the effective rate was lower than Europe, meaning that it's only in name. We've had problems with Delaware, and Delaware is like a haven country. You can actually tick the box when you do your return in the US, where you don't, you can actually change it from tax pay into double non-taxation, which is shocking. So anyway, part of this problem was recognizing that money is moving from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions. It was moving in the form of what is known as transfer pricing, meaning I transact with other companies in the group, and proper transfer pricing means that you transact at arm's length, as if you were independent. But the reality is more than 60% of world trade is intercompany. So where do you get this concept of arm's length? I mean, really? That's why it doesn't work. From a pure philosophy, it makes absolute sense. But the question is, how do you get to arm's length in an environment that is so biased? And in order to even establish what is arm's length, you need a comparables database. South Africa, if we're doing transfer pricing assessments, we need a comparables database. We have no view of the economic structure of this country. We have to use overseas comparables database. And you have to make an adjustment, but how do you make an adjustment? Another aspect in the way money moved was through loans, and they spoke about it earlier, was excessive loan funding. So you had a company sitting giving loans to everybody in the group and pulling interest, excessive loans. You also had another situation where tax arbitrage took place, and that's where you had what is known as hybrid instruments. So you could have gone from a situation of double taxation to double non-taxation. Like the US has a problem where you have what is known as stateless income. Money is sitting offshore, but nobody's taxing it. And nobody knows who's accountable for it, to what degree. That's a big problem. These were some, and obviously treaty abuse is another one. But anyway, so that was the LBC. At its height, we did brilliantly. It was a firm foundation in tackling BEPS. Illicit flows, because of its nature being illegal, or some of it being illegal, as soon as criminality entered the picture, LBC wasn't responsible. We had to collaborate with the criminal investigations guys. But if you look in the wake of Tom Moyane, and I'm going to be honest and say that it was a violent home invasion and it waged an all-out assault on the LBC. So by the time he finished, the LBC got decimated. Criminal investigations got decimated. Out goes BEPS, illicit financial flows, because what happens to decisions? Stopped. People left. People were moved around. So as a consequence of that, you have to rebuild everything from scratch. So SARS got eroded. But I think there's some interesting that has happened in the last 2 days. And what is interesting is the fact that there's a lot of intellectual capital in this room around both topics. Yesterday we spoke about case studies. Imagine going forward if SARS could collaborate with those individuals and understand and unpack what happened and then go and raise tax assessments because you've got the information. Why must SARS go re-audit? A lot of people don't like sharing with other countries, especially developed. I have the opposite. Our best capability came from developed countries, not the importation of individuals, but learning. When we sat at BEPS and had conversations in working parties and visited other revenue agencies, we saw schemes that were advanced of our country. We knew they were going to hit us 6 months down the line. We could be ready. We learned from disclosure. UK has some of the best disclosure regimes. In the same way, in each of those 15 action items you could learn. We learned from, we had an exchange engagement with India and Brazil. Brazil has a fascinating transfer pricing regime because they impose certain rates. There's no such thing as arm's length and negotiation and doing audit. Every year people come through and they just pay the bonds because they have fixed margin rates, etc. And it's frowned upon, but the point of the matter is they've got an approach. India has a highly litigious approach. They go to court on everything. And now they've had to backtrack. So from a SARS point of view, SARS was on top of everything before we had the mess and madness enter. But it's been decimated, and we need to rebuild it. SARS is key to resolving these issues. And I don't think there's a need to raise taxes. As long as you have a discernible tax gap, there's absolutely no justification to raise taxes. It requires SARS to be effective, to be efficient. If I get SARS data, SARB data real time, I know where to focus my audit. We can stop the money before it leaves the country. On that note, I'm going to stop.
Next, I think that was 3 incredible presentations. Extremely enlightening, and just following on the similar trend from what we had yesterday. So I think I actually miscalculated a little bit. We don't have 30 minutes, but we have about 45 minutes to an hour to engage. So on that note, I'll take the first round of hands. I've noted Hamida before. I'll take Daniel. Is that James? I'll take James, I'll take Ahmed, and I'll take Dick in that order.
Yes, I mean, yes, I would like to ask this question, and I think maybe it's better placed today. Now, in terms of the whole context of the future work, and I think it discriminated my question. This whole blockchain, right? So is this going to make it easier, or is it going to make it harder? And to what extent can we then use the blockchain to either track? Because I think it's a question that can be burning.
Let's take the file. No two of the questions it was directed to you. Daniel?
I think I have a question for the presenters. I think the first one to Thembi. And I'm glad about Oxfam showing their concern on how they see the OECD project or process. There's an organization called the Independent Commission on the Reformation of International Corporate Taxation. I know that Oxfam members of this independent commission. They have some fantastic not tax. I want to find out how Oxfam can in this independent commission, if possibly seeing it as becoming a counter force, the OECD process. That is, my question to Kathy is the whole issue of machine learning. I don't know whether it's possible to also discuss the cost of this machine and learning and artificial intelligence to developing countries in relation to the need to reform, both national and global tax governance. Which I mean, which of them do you think we should consider? She's painted a very strong SAS. I don't know the relations SAS has with the OECD process, especially the engagement with national tax authorities. How are they influencing SAS?
James?
Well, I'm very interested in the subject of SARS, and the U.S. is going through a very similar kind of process right now, an assault on the Internal Revenue Service by the Trump administration. They've under the Republican Congress for the last 8 years, and they're literally stopped corporate audits based on nationals. It's a real crisis. And it seems like a global strategy on the part of the right to decapitalize the public, and tax is a big part of that. So I think what we need to do is develop counter strategies. Now the OECD effort has failed in many ways. On the individual side, the proposals to have automatic information exchange, beneficial ownership are kind of held up until something around that's not going to do that. On the corporate side, country by country reporting is stalled. There's no support for many elements even in the OECD plan. And so important for South Africa to figure out how it wants to respond to this, because up till now, it's basically been going along with the OECD as the vanguard. And, can it form around the UN? And this thing, I don't know, what is that's ICRIT, yeah, ICRIT. I mean, I've testified before. They very early adopted the Tax Committee as being an alternative to the OECD. Now, the UN Tax Committee has 4 people. It has an annual budget of $1,000. Even the status of an official UN, and it's really a long. If that were the alternative, I think that were the only alternative. I think it would take years to develop that. What might work is if South Africa took the lead in this area with other development partners like India, the BRICS basically, a set of alternatives, basically approaching the idea of what's called firm, and this whole area is so laden with technical formulary apportionment. It's kind of to be considered. You would look at what really is going on within countries in terms of activities, as opposed to allowing tax havens to be parking lots for all the profits. But I mean, I think the policies here. My question, I have a question here, is what is really going to be involved in returning SARS to a functioning area here in Hague? Because South Africa relies on the corporate income tax for at least 20% of their tax revenue. It's a big contributor. And if these multinationals are able to get away with it here, they can get away with it anywhere. Because South Africa is relatively sophisticated. It's always had a relatively good revenue service.
For myself, I was part of the original team that set up the large business center, so he was there as well. And it was a statement of optimism because we literally had 3 sector managers running 8 sectors. So when you ask about, whether we can do it. I think it can be done again. It can be done at double cost again. We've done once before. So, and the learnings are there. So it's just a matter of political will. And this commission that is going on and on and on, we need to bring it to an end and shift. I mean, you need a hatchet job, otherwise you're just going to procrastinate and have a problem. Be that as it may, I mean, following on from what you're saying, embedded in our legislation is a lot of deference to the OECD. For example, the permanent establishment is defined as what is defined in the OECD. We're an associate of the OECD. In other words, we get to make input, we download our capacity to think, but we don't have any significant voting rights or anything of that in the OECD. What we need to do is we need to start a conversation, part of this Africa inter-trade scenario. We need to start a conversation around a common approach to, for example, infrastructure projects. They say it takes 12 months before, if you're here for more than 12 months as an Italian company, then only do you pay tax here. And the United Nations treaty system says 6 months. We, as Africa, should be saying 6 months. That's it. So we start increasing our tax base on that basis. We need to start shifting away from the OECD model, and I don't know whether it's going to have to be to the UN model. I think we need to start advocating a new model. That's the first point I'd like to make. Secondly, I think that what we need to clarify is that FATF, the presenter from Oxfam, FATF is in fact a intergovernmental organization, and it's accountable to damn nobody. I know because I sat on it. And the fact of the matter is that it's a serious problem, because at the end of the day, you have a lot of extra territorial jurisdiction being enforced against countries such as ours. So what will happen is that FATF will set up a standard ostensibly on the basis of counter-terrorism financing, and then enforce that every country enacts legislation or regulation on that basis. Now, there's a lot of things that don't make sense for us as a country. And we're not going to be able to engage the FATF, but we certainly can engage the FIC. And the FIC needs to become not necessarily compromised in terms of its transparency and the need for secrecy to protect against compromising investigations and so on, but we need a higher level of responsiveness to civil society. That's the necessary. Thirdly, the question of MOUs between government departments to share information only on a case-by-case basis. I recall when I was at Treasury and I did a watching brief where there was the generals and all kinds of people involved in the Tannenbaum case. And it became very apparent that we have a serious structural limitation in the enforcement in our country. We don't have a common interacting regulatory architecture, and we don't have an enforcement architecture. And I think that is something that we need to start advocating as well from civil society. The question of rating companies, I mean, I think that's a key transparency thing, Sunita. One has to insist. And I think that international reporting, IRBA and all these organizations are really, really starting to have egg on their face. Because they're really, really the alter egos of the Big Four. And so I think we need to start pushing that, not only as a national standard. If you talk about South Africa leading, I think that is a brilliant thing to do, and to start advocating it internationally as well. On the question of where dirty money needs clean money, if there's such a thing, there was a 2008 scenario was a liquidity problem and hot money came in. So the entire OECD initiative on BEPS is to prevent the most obscene effects of that system. It's not to abrogate the system. Whatever we think about, we need to think strategically about how to shift that. And if BEPS is failing or lack of participation by those who will benefit the most from it, then I think we have an opportunity here. Yeah, that's what I think.
So, so this about the AOs and even trade unions, perhaps, because that is one of the gospels that is today, is that the unions must come in and stop profit shifting, because it would raise the wage levels also in the country. One problem with it's a good idea that they should cooperate with SARS and so on. But one problem is tax secrecy. So SARS is not allowed to share any information. And we know that from AIDC. I was myself, if you remember the Canadian case, we were at SARS and told some unit there, it might even be that you were in the room, I don't know. And then they said thank you, and then they left. And we never knew, we never knew, no reward, you need to have, you had a reward center in the brain, you know. And so we never know anything, yeah, we never know anything of what happened with that case. And we don't know, of course, what happened with the logging case. But now we hear that there was a fuss, etc., but we don't know if Dlamini ever was punished for paying sales commissions to an office where nobody was selling anything. So that is and the secrecy around all kind of financial statements and so on is a big problem. And that is where really the NGO, the trade union, and investigative journalists and so on really would, if you lift the veil of secrecy over it, then 80% of the problem is solved. Because you will have sort of 85 angry journalists, trade unionists, researchers of NGOs, sort of spending time on this every day to nail the bastards, kind of. And I mean, one simple suggestion which we made to the daily stack, if you have a regular transaction, a cross-border transaction with another company, the room can be in different forms. It could be, and there are transactions in a country where the nominal corporate tax is lower than in South Africa. Then that company, the mother company in the group, must see to that the financial statements of that outfit is lodged at the CIPC, and that financial statements, which should contain related party transactions, should be made. Could be for a simple request. Can be made public and so on. So then the newspaper would be filled with this, and you know. Yeah. So the secrecy is a key thing here, and that is why Oxfam and AIBC and others are pushing this issue of the secrecy. Now the DTC report on BEPS was a disappointment, and one reason they again have this argument. They run like a red thread through the whole report is that South Africa can't do anything alone because it's bad for the competition of capital like that. It's like that one shop cannot do anything against shoplifting in the shop because all the others are allowing, and we can't intervene against shoplifting because then we will scare away the customers. That is so the DTC there was many good reports about BEPS in the DTC, very useful,
but then the final report is a disappointment because this, we can't do anything alone, is there again. Question to you, and there will be a contribution. AIDC takes part in a project about putting a special act with an anti-avoidance act, and there will be a presentation about this later. And that is about sort of what can South Africa do alone. So your opinion on that. And finally, I'm surprised that sales commissions was not on the list, but only management fees, because our experience, all the cases we have, there's always these sales commissions on the revenue of 2%, 5%, even 9%, which are paid to Malta, Dubai, Barbados, etc., etc. So I'm surprised that that was not in the list.
Thanks. Okay. So I give
Oh,
it.
I have one technical question.
Have another round. Do you want to go in this round?
I'm disciplined member of.
I'm not this question. Is it the reserve bank that is approving management fees?
The exchange control, yes, in terms of.
That's what I was thinking.
So
We're talking about the caps, etc. Yes. But also there's a reason with South.
So we will have responses to these questions, and then we will have a follow. I already know three hands: Brian, Dr. Shabalaza, Asha, and Awan. Okay. So I think maybe just respond in the same order that you spoke. So Thembinkosi, Kathy, Sunita.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think my question was more on ICRIT, the independent commission. I think as of FAM, we were one of the organizations that are supporting ICRIT. And one of the activities that we have been involved in the past is to support the initiative in Europe around the development of one tax base, which is some approach that is following unitary taxation, sort of the old thinking, but more about European companies operating in multiple jurisdictions. They need to produce information as if it was one company. And then they apply some form of formulary apportionment based on a number of indicators, such as the amount of capital that is employed in a particular jurisdiction, the number of employees, and the activity that happens in that particular jurisdiction. So that is the work that we've been supporting, meaning providing comments. But overall, if you try to understand an organization like Oxfam, there's also Northern Oxfams and Southern Oxfam. There's an imbalance even within in terms of the resources that are existing within the organizations. And also some other political questions such as where the power lies and whose ideas are always taken on board. So as the Southern Oxfams, we do feel that our voices are not necessarily the ones that are always at the forefront of these initiatives. So we do think that it then becomes important at the domestic level to be able to work together with our own civil societies and develop credible Southern positions on these matters, so that we are able to go on our own and say, look, as our own groups, this is what we want, so that we make sure that the reforms that are happening at the global stage are representatives of the views from the South and are applicable in the South as well. Okay.
So, Nita, on your blockchain question, so at FIC, when we looked at the risk of cryptocurrency, so you've got the currency and the blockchain, which makes the technology quite fascinating, right? Because it's got all the sort of qualities of money, so it's a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and all that stuff, but it's also got this ledger, and a lot of the power lies in what the blockchain actually can. So the risks on the trade side are not as high as the risks on the capital side. So for example, if you're exporting and you're going to pay using Bitcoin, or a product has to arrive, so touch the job properly, you can see that, and assuming that the dots, that should be okay. The bigger risk is not on the capital side. So if I go and I work in the US for 6 months, I earn dollars, I can quickly convert my dollars into Bitcoin, I can arrive at Bitcoin, and I can exchange it into rands, but you'll never see the conversion from rands into dollars and vice versa, right? And that's the risk on the capital account side. On the can it make life easier or not? There's a lot of work that's been done in the space, and there's a fascinating company called Provenance. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a blockchain company. And one of the things they started doing about 5 years ago was to actually stop the blood diamond trade. So they go and they take the biometric signature. Biometric is very common. So the characteristics of every diamond, and they log it and they register it on the database. About 3 years ago, when I was presenting at a blockchain at a conference, they had already done about 1.5 million diamonds that they had recorded. If that diamond rocks up somewhere, you can actually check it on that system. So, and Providence was trying to move into sort of like high value items. So they were going to try and work with rhino horn and do the same thing with that one that I don't really know. So there are companies that are trying to innovate in the space where you could use the blockchain and this open ledger to do that. As transactions move into the sort of international space, where it's easier to actually convert your local currency via Bitcoin into a foreign currency, because it's an instantaneous transaction, those become recordable and traceable, right? You might not know who the wallet belongs to, but you can actually identify how much money is going to it. So in time, that will get sorted out, and there are companies that are working with the CIA and the British intelligence that are trying to sort of understand which companies are doing what and are involved in black market trade, etc., on the back end of the blockchain. So it's actually not anonymous, which is a misnomer. It's actually what they call pseudonymous, because you do leave a digital footprint.
Sorry, Kathy, just before you go on, because I think it's important for all of us to be on the same page. And when we use acronyms and new concepts like blockchain, I think we're losing people. So perhaps if you could just explain what blockchain.
Because I mean, you'd have to use a whole one on Bitcoin and blockchain. So, blockchain is actually just the underpinning technology that sits sort of underneath the actual cryptocurrency that sits on top. It sounds a bit confusing. So what it really is a system where you've got a whole lot of machines. It's crazy, but let me tell you where it starts. So the idea of blockchain technology started from the gaming world. You know, where these guys go and they play and however many people you can shoot or kill, you get points and you work in like, you earn a whole lot of coins or whatever. Blockchain is exactly, that technology came from that environment. So the idea behind it is you've got a machine that sits and runs a series of algorithms and it has to solve a particular block. And a block is a complex algorithm that this machine is running a series of algorithms, and it's all the machines across the world that are trying to race to the finish line to try and solve that particular block. And each block earns a coin. And that coin basically becomes, to earn that coin, it becomes harder and harder. So initially it would take you like a minute to solve a block. Currently it's sitting closer to 10 minutes. And it will eventually take you a day to solve a block and get a coin. And so the machine that actually works the hardest, in other words, that shot like the most villains or whatever, and has worked the hardest in trying to solve the block, is wins the coin. And when you win that coin, the way that you can prove that you're working in the system internationally is to actually verify transactions in that process. So that's the very long and the short of how this works. So every person that is buying and selling coins in that 10 minutes that the machine is processing that algorithm, it verifies that I, wallet ABC, bought so many coins from wallet XYZ, or vice versa. So the way you verify that you're actually working is to validate those transactions. And that's why it takes a few minutes to do. Progressively, it will take longer and longer to do. So what it does is, yes, it's a currency that sits on top, but actually underpinning it is the blockchain. And in that block, in that 10 minutes, while it's solving the algorithm, it has a register, an audit trail of every single wallet that has bought and sold in those 10 minutes. Now that wallet means nothing, right? It's like 2ZJK5, it's like a 36 digits, it means nothing. It's like an email address, it's a whole series of jumbled up numbers, right? But that belongs to someone. And so what it does is it keeps a very clear trail of what happened in those 10 minutes, buying and selling. Now that's a very simplified form of it, right? So it's the block itself is almost like a little post box that keeps a record of what's going on. Now that thing is cryptographically secure, so now you can actually store all your personal information, so they're starting to use it in the identity space. So work I did for the South African for Home Affairs actually is how you use blockchain technology to store secure identity information because it's cryptographically secure. So it's starting to be used in so many other places. What it has done is there's so many different platforms of what they call middleware platforms. So for example, Ripple is an example of a middleware platform, and what it allows companies to do, and it's been endorsed by the Australian Central Bank, is it allows banks in Australia to basically transact with their counterparty banks anywhere across the world in a span of 10 minutes, or 3 minutes, or 2 minutes. Ripple is its own coin, but similar to Bitcoin. But it can actually transact instantaneously. So you have to think about it. In the old days, if you wanted to exchange rands into dollars, you'd have to take forward cover, you'd have to insure it, it would take like 3 days before it cleared, depending on which way the rand was going. Now it's done instantaneously, all of that has disappeared. So it's being moved into more and more places technologically. So that's just the very long and the short of Bitcoin and blockchain. So the real power is now in what that block can do. They call it smart scripting or smart contracting, which allows you to say, if you go online to, let's say, Business Live and you want to read articles, you could attach blockchain to that to say, if you're an entry-level client, you can only see these articles. If you're a premium client and you pay X, you can see those. So it can do all of that stuff. You know, these like trigger activities. Okay. So just a very long and the short of it, but that's in my head. Right, to Daniel's question, how do we deal with like machine learning and that in developing countries? So you don't want to go and buy a state-of-the-art massive system that costs fortunes. For example, like Go AML, which is worth, I don't know, 120 million. You don't want to do that. There's a lot of stuff that you can actually access that's available in open source space. And really what you're trying to do is triangulate all the big data that sits in government. And the easiest one to triangulate is SARS tax information with customs data information with South African Reserve Bank cross-border flows. If you triangulate those three, you've already done a hell of a lot in that particular space. It's not, and there's a lot of work that's been done in the space. I mean, I know 2 academics that are keen to actually even take more data. So we're going to try and pilot that in Namibia, where we're actually taking their raw data to actually do that. So the idea is not to go and spend millions and millions as a developing state-of-the-art programs, but rather, and you saw Sunita and did it with Excel, right? So it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. You can actually do a little bit of SAS coding or SPSS coding, or so your software might be a little bit more expensive at the beginning, but the amount of data you can analyze is huge. So I just want to tell you a little story. When we were at the FIC, we used to get data from the South African Reserve Bank, and we used Excel because we didn't want to buy SAS or GAPS or SPSS or STATE or whatever. And so we used to get hundreds of thousands of lines of information into Excel. It chops off the bottom half of the data that it can't read. So the FIC used to only read the first, whatever, 90,000 rows and forgot about the rest, right? Used to truncate it. You don't want to be doing that. So it's not, they don't have to be expensive things, and actually very quickly with artificial intelligence. So PayPal is using it now, for example. They are using, they take the auditors and they try and talk to them to try and get what's in their heads and say, as an auditor, what makes a transaction suspicious? And they've taught that into the machine learning environment, and now they pre-identify what they flag as suspicious or fake transactions. So there's a lot of practice out there already, especially around transit pricing, etc. So it's not new stuff. It's quite easy to. Okay. Into this comment, I thought it was quite fascinating, right? So how do we take this going forward? And it's not just about SARS. At the FIC, we have an interdepartmental working committee with SARS and the DTI and Treasury and DIRCO actually. And we had a very strong push to put illicit flows into the G20 agenda, which was the only way we could sell it, right? And ironically, our biggest fight was the US, which we couldn't sell. And every time we had put sort of some of the benchmark pricing stuff onto the table and putting these tools to evaluate customs and look at transfer pricing pressure around trade pricing. It was hectic to try and negotiate. So, and then we had fights with the US Treasury and the US Trade Union. And,
When is this?
it was in 2016. So, so I think just before your current sort of crisis that is in terms of the
It's gotten worse, but it was bad then.
it was bad then already. So we had to get the OECD to step in and try to support us. And the way we solved it is South Africa represents the African continent as the only G20 country in the G20 for Africa. And so we tried to push that agenda, but and so my unit was closed down in 2016, much like Sunita's, right? We were just, I was given 30 minutes notice, cheers, move along. So, and that's because we were starting to point to really large numbers of capital flights, filters, etc., and nobody was prepared to look at it. And so there was no champion in government to actually drive this agenda, and that's where it stayed, right? So DERCO has got it as one of its top 5 agenda items. They've done that much about it. They've got pretty weak capacity. And what we used to do is we would write all the technical notes and all those to try and push the agenda. So there is an option through like a G20 agenda, and I like the idea of, you know, what does the agenda mean from a trade perspective for Africa? What does it mean for South Africa? How do you put this agenda on the continent? The bigger concerns that if you talk to GFI is that if you look at the World Bank agenda from the spring talks, this topic is not on there anymore, right? So you've got the Centre for Development that is saying, oh, these numbers are big and it's all a load of nonsense. Actually, it's just corruption because you developing countries are so corrupt, and actually sort out your corruption and it's nothing else. And it's really about, it's the same shift, right? That we don't want to hold large corporates, multinationals accountable. We're allowing them to get away with absolute murder. And we're allowing these naysayers to actually allow governments to do very little because the risks seem very small, right? When we were looking at the stuff and you were telling me 300-400 billion rand, I'm going to do something about it. But if you tell me it's like, you know, 5 billion rand or 7 for your country, why am I going to put my neck on the line? Huge issues, and it's not just about sort of taking the agenda into like the UN, but I think it's a broader agenda for the continent as well. Ahmed, you've got some interesting comments. I think the one that sort of struck me the most was the FATF one. So FATF is an OECD body, right? So it actually does, it's an OECD body that tells everybody what to do. And South Africa sits on it because it is an OECD associate and it's a G20 member because FATF also gets its mandate and its marching orders from the G20. So South Africa sits there as an OECD rep, as a rep for Africa, which it does very little about, but also sits on bodies like Egmont, which are these softer bodies where you try and create mechanisms where we can learn from each other, etc. So I think there are issues, and South Africa takes like the FIC, or the FIC takes the FATF letter, like to the letter, the laws, and tries to apply them. And we probably have one of the leading legislative leaders in this area, so backward, and he leads in that space. So I don't know that if you tell them, well, we'd like something different, that they'll ever look at it because they take FATF's word as gospel truth, right?
So that's the purpose.
That is the problem, right? And I think that, and I don't think, you know, there's a problem with that. On rating, and I always said you need to introduce a social network analysis. So you want to not only rank a company, but and it's again part of this big data analytics stuff, right? So you want to say, okay, we've audited this particular company, this is its banker, this is its auditor, this is its accounting firm, etc. And you start to identify, so if that company's got dodgy sort of books and that, and they're evading tax, you want to identify who the accountant and the auditor is, and identify all of their companies, and fundamentally start blacklisting, you know, these bankers, etc., that might be complicit, or auditors, etc., and then allow them to kind of work their way back up. But Because you're guaranteed, if I'm using this method for company A, you're guaranteed I'm using it for every other audit as well, and I haven't been audited. So you want to start doing that kind of social networking analysis, find out who are the owners of that company and start sort of mapping it out. So it's part of a blacklisting system as well, and if you get blacklisted, which I don't know what that means, maybe Sunita can comment on that from company credibility perspective. If I'm an accountant and I'm blacklisted by SARS, I mean, I probably won't be able to put any bread on the table, but I've got to work my way back into kind of getting clean books, right? And I think, that's it from my side. You're going to cover the management fees one, so I don't need to tackle that. So. Cool. I think I've done everything. And more, yeah.
Blockchain.
101.
I'm just going to pick up on the blockchain because there are a lot of articles on blockchain and how it can improve compliance. I know that SARS, in the last month or so, I think we were having some talks around how they use digital economy to make tax better, etc. And blockchain is key in that. So I would refer you to some of those papers because the aim of blockchain is to be able to track the supply chain, but also have information being provided and putting the burden on the outside and returning in and external information that is probably less manipulated than normally be the case. But another interesting concept is also, from an accounting point of view, is the whole concept of XBRL. If your financial statements are done in an XBRL format, and I think there's a worldwide trend to try and move companies to XBRL, you're actually tagging every item on the financial statement. So then it becomes easier to then understand what's sitting in the financial statement and to help when one is looking at the compliance or an enforcement point of view. I think technology is going to change the way we actually do business, and again, even AI is going to change the way we do business. I know for a fact that there are auditing and legal firms that are currently exploring how to use AI. In terms of, and it's actually opening up a can of worms, but and some confessions. So I'll be ready.
Confessions are good.
And then I'm also going to talk about this, but you may or may not know that I sat on the BEPS committee making the decision. So I was the only one on the African continent that sat at the BEPS bureau. We had SARS representatives sitting in the working party. So we had a working party on staff that was dealing with aggressive tax planning, dealing with digital economy, dealing with transfer pricing. I sat in the bureau. These working parties will actually provide information on each of the BEPS actions. It will be presented at bureau level. I will then sit on the committee of fiscal affairs, where the decision will be made to accept something or not accept something. Now, on the issue of self-determination, sitting on these committees were 8 OECD countries, the big ones that we know, but also Brazil, China, South Africa, and India. We all sat on equal footing, meaning that we had to get consensus on an item. So things did not move ahead until we got consensus. When we started off, and I'll be honest, it was UK, the US, and Germany that drove. But midway through, South Africa, Brazil, China, and India kept blocking and pushing our agenda. I'll give you two key examples. The country by the way, the first report has already been exchanged in South Africa. So it's not stopped, it's moving ahead. The country by country reporting, we argued for more information. We pushed for more information. South Africa, myself and Ivan Police sent a report through to herself, the head of tax and OECD. We refused to budge on that report until we got the agreement that there would be a review of the information in 2020, so that if revenue administrations didn't get enough information with what was happening with the country by country reporting, that we could revisit and reopen the categories. We pushed for more information was required. I sat in meetings where we sat with trade unions, global trade unions, as well as civil society, as well as some of the multinationals. You're familiar with USCIB? I'll tell you about them this time. It's an organization that represents business in the US. Pushback. People might not realize that yes, everything on the BEPS wasn't an absolute success, but it's a directional change. And it's important because it shifts the balance. And the country by country reporting is a game changer. Companies did not want to give us information, they fought us. I remember sitting in a discussion with them, like 2 hours between 7 and 9 o'clock in the evening in Paris. Not very pleasant when you can't be outside. But they're pushing back and saying we don't want to give this. We're not happy about how this information will be used. And that is the biggest issue. We have to compromise on the fact that it's going to be used in a certain way. If it's abused in a particular way, you could stop sharing that information. We have to compromise on all the categories. But it is a step in the right direction. Because already, if you look at the country by country reporting, it's going to tell you which jurisdiction a multinational is present. It's going to tell you how much taxes are there, how much employees you have, how much assets you have, how much money you make. You can look at that and see I've got a problem because you've got presence in so many haven countries.
But it's not public,
Now, let me talk about the fact that it's not public. It's
so it can't be audited. Who's going to audit this?
No, but remember, let me explain the role of the CBC. The role of the CBC is not a tax assessment. It's a risk assessment for revenue authority. Meaning that I would get it, I would look at it, I would say, well, actually, this particular multinational in South Africa has so much profit, 60% of their profits are sitting in low tax jurisdictions. But actually the key activity underlying those profits comes from South Africa. Therefore, I will push you into audit. You cannot raise an assessment on the basis of the CBCR. You have to still go and get your audit evidence. It's only a hint, it's a do. Now, it's only government to government exchange because companies were even resisting. Even throughout the process, they were resisting. Let me talk about the US. James, you're probably familiar with Robert Stack, who's the Secretary for International Tax.
We wrote the check the box rule.
Yeah, no problem. I gave a keynote speech in Washington in 2016 to 200 multinationals, the biggest US 200 multinationals. And I was explaining about the challenges that developing countries have around tax compliance. And a lot of people came to me afterwards, including some of the NGOs, to say that they didn't understand the challenges. But what was interesting about that session, it was about a BEPS session. So in the BEPS Bureau, Robert Stack, the US guy, was a peer. We would all make decisions. Robert openly said there was one stage where he was very upset because the whole committee pushed back against him to say, you cannot sit here and refuse to do this. And he acknowledged to all of us that he had a challenge because US is run by big corporates and lobbyists. And so he would make certain decisions, like an article blazoned across the global press to say, we disagree. So even at the US CID conference, he said, you went against everything that. So I accused him openly of a marital partner that cheats. But that's the set of the matter is US has its own particular challenges. And they can't make much decisions around taxing corporates and high wealth individuals because it's a particular environment. But be that as it may, somebody once mentioned at a conference, if you're not sitting at the table, be careful you're not on the menu because you'll be eaten. We chose to be at the table. SARS is always sat in an observer capacity, but BEPS allowed us to be on equal footing. Another area where we actually blocked, there was a proposal in one of the actions around mandatory arbitration. What does that mean? If I got to dispute with another country around how to treat it and who the tax base belongs to, and where the money will be paid, somebody else from another developed country can come in and make a decision, and I've got to live with it. And the taxpayer can keep appealing until they're happy with the decision. We pushed that. It's even stated in the notes that we actually didn't agree to. So all of that stuff that we didn't agree to is not sitting in South Africa. We always think that we have to accept, we don't have to accept. We knew that we were the only ones represented at BEPS, but we also understood that from a continent point of view, it was important because this is a developing country issue. What did we do? We sat with ATAP. ATAP formulated what is known as a technical committee. I had on the technical committee. We liaised on every single action item with all the countries that were present. I think ATAP has like around 36 countries on the continent present. We then forwarded those inputs into BEPS and the OECD. You might not know this, but every single submission sent to our BEPS is sitting on the OECD website. Don't let ignorance say, I don't have a hand and I cannot influence. Because if you look at it, you can see there's responses from all people. There's responses from auditing firms, from NGOs, from trade unions. So don't underestimate your ability to make a change. Now, I want to talk about who's the best body. I don't think anyone's the best body, but I think we're sitting in a situation that has a history and a legacy, and I think focusing on the best body right now is the least of our problems. I'm more interested about the 50 billion that we need to bring in. And you might not know this. The OECD project, BEPS project, took 2 years to finalize. The last time the international tax rules were written, remember this is not legislated, it is an international framework, a guidance, was in 1920 by the League of Nations. Rules needed to be renovated for a new world, a different business environment, a globalized world. The OECD did that in 2 years. At one of the CFA meetings, I raised the question because in the room, IMF is represented, World Bank is represented, UN is represented. There was a move and a suggestion that the UN take over the BEPS program. I raised the question, and how many tax matters have you resolved and moved ahead? They acknowledged they had 5 items that were sitting there for years and had not moved, and they didn't have the resources as you mentioned. Now, my concern is I think we've got more achieved in completing something than sitting with somebody that possibly has maybe the right intention, but it might take a while to get there. But the question is, who's actually better? It's not who's better, because both models are based on the same thing, except the UN probably has a little bit more of a bias from a source point of view. And that needs to be explored. So the question should be, should we not be making sure that the overall model allows for things like India and China are fighting for what they say is location savings, meaning that because of their markets, the size of the markets and the cheapness of labor, they want to argue that when we doing a transaction, we deserve greater return because we're providing a unique service. That's what they want. So they want to fight for a bigger share of the pie. Now, the UN model will probably help a little bit, but ultimately all these issues need to come into play. So for me, the issue is, it's not a question of OECD versus UN. It's a question of how do we take the current status quo and make it better and make it worse. That countries actually don't rush ahead, because when somebody rushes ahead, they create the race to the bottom. How do we hold other countries in check? You've got UK, they come up with what is known as diverted profits tax to disincentivize transfer pricing, etc. But on the other hand, they and offer a favorable tax regime. So you've got this kind of schizophrenic behavior across a lot of countries. And from a developing country perspective, our biggest issue is, somebody mentioned minerals. We're commodity rich, but we can't even measure what's coming out of the ground. So that's a point of urgency. But equally, it's a transfer pricing, I need to build capability. I can say in the last few years, IMF, World Bank, UN, and OECD have worked together to set up toolkits. And they did exchange programs where they had a person come in and work with the team on an audit and take it to completion and bank revenue. It's a good thing. If somebody's got knowledge, I'm going to exploit it. I don't care who you are and where you are. As long as my country is benefiting. We've got a big problem on the continent with tax incentives. There was a study that was done that said in more than 70% of the cases, those investments would have been made regardless of whether the tax incentives were given. So why did we give away money that we shouldn't have been given in the first place? Those are some of Africa's problems. I just want to talk about a few other things that you mentioned. By the way, the UN, if you do this for every industry, critical tariff lines, you
practices that they've been figured in. So many of these corporations are, if you were going to go after them, they're going to just pay a fine, and that's going to be the end of the story. And they carry on and make more sophisticated the practices that they are involved in. Then I'm wondering to what extent at SARB there is a kind of benchmark under which they allow management fees and marketing fees. If it's under 2% fees and marketing fees, if it's under 2%, does it sort of
the actual unit that was established previously was called a harmful tax competition unit. And with American pushback again, says, with American resistance to it, it became a unit that just focused on transfer pricing and base erosion and profit shifting. It basically was whittled down. And now that you describe the whole OECD consensus type process the way you do, is there a possibility that this block comprising South Africa, India, China, for example, can bring that harmful tax competition focus back into the OECD? Um, yeah, those were my.
My understanding is that currently, like, the tax system has too complicated rules, and that we should move for simpler set of rules. And so my question is around the possibility for South Africa, or maybe South Africa as part of the BRICS, to move unilaterally to such sets of rules. So, for example, you spoke about the digital economy. Why not following the EU example, the proposal discussed recently to say, look, we're not going to tax profit anymore. We're going to have a percentage of the turnover of the company locally to tax digital company and tax them directly, so that we are not shortcutted by transfer pricing techniques. Another example could be intellectual property. Why not saying, as the Chinese did, okay, you come invest in my country, have production in my country, but then it's compulsory for you to transfer your technology locally, so you don't have any more transfer pricing method related to intellectual property, patents, brand rights, things like that. Samely for transparency, you mentioned how like this was a huge battle within the OECD BEPS process to have country by country reporting and on a proper scale, like not a limited set of information. Why not? Why South Africa could not say unilaterally, okay, you're investing in my country, so either you complain, either you don't come. And saying that by coming in South Africa or by coming in any of the big country, why don't you have to, as a rule, to comply to stronger transparency rules? So you mentioned how you feel the apportionment formula is a false solution. Could you say a little bit if you feel that the profit split method could be useful for South Africa to try to have some kind of simple, more simple ways to deal with transfer pricing techniques of multinational companies? And the last point, which is a bit on a different point, which is the enablers. You mentioned the enablers and how they play a huge role in facilitating tax transparency. And you mentioned Big Four auditing firm or accounting firm. I'm not sure how this could unfold, but do you think there is in some way, a possibility to dismantle this huge trust or this huge like company into smaller entity, easier to control, and if needed, for example, to like ban them or forbid them, like withdrawing their licenses by making them smaller? Is this a possibility? Yeah.
My question is to ask if they were to say what they would suggest civil society advocate for, maybe your top three things and who you would advocate that to.
Kosi,
Most of the questions which were asked, they cover my question.
Okay, mine is not a question, but maybe a submission. Okay, so I'm with Publisher to Pay South Africa, and Publisher to Pay globally is working on transparency and accountability in the extractive sector or mining and gas. And one of the things that we're doing at Publisher to Pay South Africa is working with countries that have already started implementing mandatory disclosures for payments to governments. And so we have partnered with Publisher in the UK because UK actually publishes the UK companies actually publish what they pay to the South African government. So we're working on analyzing those payments. For 2016, there's 7